the moment security forced a simple black woman out of a federal building without reason. They thought they were removing just another nobody, but they had just humiliated the newly appointed federal justice advisor. Within days, her first act in office launched a sweeping probe that cost careers, exposed corruption, and shattered the agency's leadership from the inside out. What started with racism ended with national reckoning. Dawn Whitaker's first steps echoed sharply on the marble floor of the Wallace building, as if the ground wasn't used to the sound of her heels. Her dark blazer soaked up the sterile white light of the lobby, but it was her rich brown skin that seemed to trip silent alarms. Her tightly coiled afro, bold features, and calm, upright posture sliced through the space like a quiet declaration. She didn't smile, she didn't shrink, and in that place, that alone was almost an act of defiance. A white man in a suit brushed past her, glancing for a split second as if she'd wandered into the wrong room. Moments later, a receptionist behind the counter paused her typing, craned her neck, and resumed with a little more force. The lobby was pristine, modern, efficient, and thick with unspoken rules about who belonged. Dawn carried only a folder and a temporary badge. But here, it wasn't what she carried that stirred unease. It was who she was. Two white security guards a few yards away exchanged a look. The younger one, Kyle, took half a step forward, as if spotting a problem. He didn't know her name, but he recognized the institutional discomfort that came with a certain kind of skin. His eyes flicked to her outfit, her shoes, then her face. Something didn't add up. Not fear, habit. The habit of tying black presence to trouble. As Dawn approached the reception desk, Kyle was already moving, his gesture restrained but alert. His face didn't ask for help, nor did it offer any. It was the kind of approach that didn't need shouting to feel violent. It just was. The air between them grew heavy, and though no alarms blared, Dawn knew, as she had so many times before, that the real entrance was the one they'd try to shut quietly, right there. She was 2 steps from the desk when Kyle, now openly assertive, stepped closer and raised his voice. "Where do you think you're going?" The lobby fell silent. Dawn stopped, standing tall, clutching her folder with both hands. "I have a meeting on the 11th floor," she replied, her tone steady. Kyle gave a sarcastic chuckle and shook his head. "Sure you do, and I'm the CEO." What had been suspicion turned into public provocation. Kyle glanced at the onlookers, gesturing as if performing a stand-up routine. "Get this, she says she's here for a meeting on the executive floor. Must have missed the comedy show memo." A white woman behind Dawn let out an awkward laugh. Kyle fed off the crowd. "You think just because you threw on that suit you can stroll in here like you run the place?" he said, his tone hardening. "Lower your voice and show us what you're selling." Before Dawn could respond, Thomas Crane approached with heavy steps. Eyes narrowed. "Is there a problem, Kyle?" The younger guard smirked. "Just someone who walked into the wrong building acting like she owns it." Thomas turned to Dawn, sizing her up. "You don't look like staff, or a scheduled visitor." The pause was sharp. "In fact, you look more like someone lost. Happens a lot." The emphasis on "you" wasn't accidental, nor was the intent. Dawn felt heat rise in her ears. It wasn't her first time feeling eyes burn into her back in a building like this, but there was something uglier that morning. Something in the men's laughter, something in the disapproving glances around her. She glanced at the temporary badge clipped discreetly to her blazer, but she knew, here, documents didn't matter. What mattered was the body they were attached to. And to those men, that body didn't have permission to be there. With calm, deliberate movements, Dawn unbuttoned the flap of her folder, as if facts could undo a misunderstanding. "Here are the meeting documents. I can show you now." But before she could touch the zipper, Kyle snapped, "I said you need to leave. You're past the line." His tone was a command, not a conversation. To him, the contents of her folder were irrelevant. Her appearance had already told him everything he needed to know. Thomas stepped beside his colleague, arms crossed, his stance worn by years of overused authority. His gaze was colder than the lobby's air conditioning. "You heard my partner. This isn't a place to wander without clearance." Dawn tried to speak, but he cut her off firmly. "We don't want trouble." The words rang like a threat, though spoken calmly. A blunt warning, leaving no room for pushback. Employees and visitors watched from the reception area, but no one stepped in. A man in a suit looked away when he saw Dawn being verbally cornered. A woman clutched her purse tighter, as if standing near her might be risky. In the quiet lobby, every non-intervention weighed heavier than 1,000 words. It was the kind of scene that played out too often, always cloaked in the same racial convenience. Dawn didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't beg. She kept her folder closed, held against her chest like a silent shield of her truth. She knew opening those papers now would be pointless. They'd already decided she didn't belong. And as the lobby stood frozen, a portrait of bureaucracy and apathy, the real story unfolded before dozens of witnesses who chose to look the other way. Thomas took a step forward and, without asking, grabbed Dawn's arm firmly. The grip wasn't brutal, but invasive enough to make it clear she had no choice. She stiffened and pulled her arm back. "Please don't touch me," she said, her voice still controlled, but now edged with warning. Kyle, behind him, was already pressing the radio button on his shoulder. To them, it was all protocol. To her, it was a signal of what was coming. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, ma'am," Thomas said, now grabbing the back of her blazer, trying to steer her toward the exit. Dawn held her ground, but didn't lash out. "I'm not making anything harder. I just want to show who I am." He ignored her completely. His eyes didn't see a professional trying to identify herself, just a black body that needed to be removed quickly, a disruption in the white space they guarded. The sound of the automatic doors sliding open rang like a verdict as they neared the main entrance. No one in the lobby moved. A guard at the side counter watched without a word. A receptionist with glasses shuffled papers with shaky hands, pretending it was business as usual. Dawn was escorted out as if she'd committed a crime, without a shout, without a hidden weapon, without a shred of justification. Her only offense was the face she carried. On the cold granite sidewalk, Thomas released her arm and jerked his chin toward the street. "This way, please." The sun hadn't yet broken through the clouds, and the city hummed along, oblivious to the fact that behind those glass doors, a black woman had just been humiliated in front of dozens. Dawn adjusted her blazer and clutched her folder to her chest, as if piecing her dignity back together. No apology, no explanation, just the muffled sound of the doors sealing shut behind her. She stopped right there, a few feet from the entrance. She didn't cry. She didn't walk away. She just took a deep breath and looked at the sky as if asking, how many more times? It wasn't her first time being judged before being heard, but something felt different this time. There, in front of a building where she was meant to start her most critical role, she'd been treated as a mistake, and that was exactly why what came next wouldn't fade quietly. Dawn sat slowly on a concrete bench a few yards from the entrance, her blazer still neat, her folder still firm in her arms, as if resisting the humiliation was also a way of refusing to let the story end there. She scanned the street, watching cars pass and people hurry by, all unaware of what had just happened. Then she opened her bag, pulled out her phone, and dialed calmly. No tremble in her hands, no rush in her movements. "Good afternoon. This is Dawn Whitaker. Activate the protocol," she said in a low, steel-steady voice. "I want the Office of Institutional Oversight notified, effective immediately." On the other end, the silence lasted less than 2 seconds. "Dawn, what happened? They stopped you from entering?" asked Sheila Moreno, the chief of staff, her voice carrying the weight of someone who already sensed the outrage. "They didn't let me show anything," Dawn replied. "Not even open my folder." From that moment, something began to shift, not on the streets, but in the corridors of power. Sheila hung up without making promises. She didn't need to. Dawn's words were enough to set in motion the weight of someone who knew exactly where to strike. On the sidewalk, no one could have guessed that the woman forcibly removed was sparking a chain reaction. The very headquarters of the State Department of Justice had just been put under scrutiny, and no one but Dawn and Sheila knew it. Dawn crossed her legs, tucked her phone away with the same composure she'd shown when she took it out. She scanned the building in front of her, as if she were no longer outside, but above it. She knew what had happened, and more importantly, she knew what it meant. Those men had made more than a mistake. Without realizing it, they'd signed the warrant for their own authority, and Dawn's silence was just the first page of the response. Dawn Whitaker had been appointed directly by the White House to one of the most sensitive roles of the moment, Federal Justice Advisor. Her mission was to lead a national task force investigating discriminatory practices within government agencies and public buildings. The newly created position, born from reports of recurring abuses in federal departments, reported directly to the Attorney General's office. It was a high-level role and required absolute discretion in its early days. The initial phase was covert by design. The plan was for Dawn to move through federal buildings unannounced, observing firsthand how ordinary citizens, especially women and black people, were treated in institutional settings. Her badge, though legitimate, didn't reveal her full role, per direct orders from Washington. What was meant to be a period of quiet observation and diagnosis became, before lunch, a glaring snapshot of the reality she'd been tasked to change. The State Department of Justice didn't know who she was, but they should have known how to treat any citizen. Yet the way she was handled showed exactly why her role existed. Dawn wasn't blocked for lack of credentials, but for an excess of presence, for walking with confidence, for not appearing submissive, for having the skin tone the system still equated with error. And that morning, without realizing it, the guards had challenged and failed before the new face of federal justice. As the glass doors closed behind Dawn, Kyle let out a short laugh, not bothering to hide it. These people think they can just walk in anywhere, just because they dress up and carry themselves like they're somebody, he said, heading back to his post. He didn't bother whispering. He wasn't worried about who might hear. It was the kind of comment that, in that space, felt like part of the AC, always there, never questioned. Thomas, radio still clipped to his shoulder, tossed a paper in the trash and muttered, "Probably came to drop off a resume or grab coffee for someone," but walked in like she owned the place. He wasn't angry. He was certain. It was the certainty of what he saw. A black woman who dared to move with confidence in a space where that was still read as a threat. And for that, in their eyes, she deserved the pushback. It didn't matter what she had to say. It mattered what she represented. What neither of them knew was that the Wallace Building's internal system, upgraded after security audits, automatically recorded audio and video in all public areas. Every word, every laugh, every glance they exchanged was saved to a federal server. While they acted as if they'd won a silent battle, the evidence that would seal their fate was already being stored, bite by bite, second by second. 40 minutes after the incident, a black sedan pulled up to the Wallace Building with the urgency of someone with no time to spare. From the back door stepped Sheila Moreno, a Latina woman, short, hair in a tight bun, folders under her arm, and a storm brewing in her expression. She climbed the steps almost at a run, not acknowledging the doorman. Crossing the entrance and spotting Dawn on the bench outside, she stopped dead. Fury rose before words. "Excuse me!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the lobby like a blade. Kyle looked up and froze. "Did you people throw that woman out of here?" She pointed outside, her finger trembling with rage. "Have you lost your minds? She's the new federal justice advisor, appointed by the White House. And you kicked her out like she was a trespasser?" The lobby went still. No one blinked. It was as if the whole building had heard an explosion. Thomas tried to hold his stance, but his hand shook slightly on his holster. Kyle stepped back, pale. The receptionist, who'd been feigning normalcy, dropped her pen. Sheila's words hit like a shockwave. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a mistake against the wrong person, at the wrong time, under the right cameras. And for the first time that morning, the silence stopped being convenient. It became fear. Sheila marched to the glass door and shoved it open, not waiting for the automatic sensor. "Dawn, please, come with me." Her tone shifted, from outrage to absolute respect. She held the door open, her body itself an apology. As Dawn stood and walked back into the building, eyes darted away, ashamed. And for the first time, the men who'd barked orders now looked like kids caught doing something they couldn't fix. The news spread through the corridors like wildfire. Barry Milton, the Wallace Building's administrative director, hurried down from the 10th floor, face flushed, steps uneven. His tie was crooked, sweat beading at his temples. When he reached the lobby, he saw Sheila and Dawn standing side by side, facing the two paralyzed guards. "Ms. Whitaker, please, let me explain. There was a misunderstanding." Dawn didn't reply. She calmly opened her folder and pulled out a clear envelope, handing it to Barry with the same composure she'd shown when escorted out. Inside were her federal appointment documents, a letter signed by the Attorney General's office, and copies of internal memos warning of unannounced institutional oversight visits. Barry read the top page and went pale. "My God," he muttered, but there was more. Attached to the appointment papers was a bound dossier compiling formal complaints from former employees and visitors, all about the same building. Cases of discriminatory treatment by security, excessive searches, racial remarks, all documented and filed. Dawn had brought it all with her, not as a threat, but as a warning. And now, that warning was evidence in the face of someone trying to smooth things over with a rushed apology. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand anything. With her folder now closed, she said simply, "This building is under federal review starting today." The words landed like a gavel. Barry didn't know how to respond. The lobby suddenly felt smaller, as if the air had been sucked out. There was no protocol for this, no way to undo it. And deep down, he knew. What started as just another morning would become a stain on the building's reputation for good. As Barry scrambled for words, Sheila's phone buzzed insistently in her blazer pocket. She answered without hesitation, and the voice on the other end was firm, unmistakable. "This is the White House Chief of Staff. The situation is confirmed. Proceed as instructed," Sheila replied with a crisp, "Understood." Hanging up, she didn't pause. She looked at Barry with unyielding eyes. The order came from Washington. Immediate suspension. "They're out. Now," she said loudly, for the packed lobby to hear. Barry tried to interject. "But maybe we should wait for a full Sheila raised a hand, cutting him off. "The investigation will happen, but not with them armed inside this building." Kyle and Thomas exchanged desperate glances, trying to stay composed. But what had happened to Dawn was now happening to them, and everyone knew. No one was coming out on top. 2 other uniformed guards approached. "Renner, Crane, please hand over your radios and follow the team outside." The voice was procedural, but the atmosphere was a courtroom. Thomas hesitated. Kyle looked ready to argue but swallowed his words. They complied in silence, crossing the lobby with heads down, under the same gazes that had silently cheered them on minutes earlier. Now, no one spoke up for them. Dawn watched it all without a word, arms crossed, folders still at her side, eyes locked on the path of the 2 men being led out. The irony was impossible to miss. They were removed the same way they'd removed her, coldly, without listening, without empathy. But there was a key difference. She didn't need to shout. The system they'd used to exclude was now turning on them. Hours after the guards' removal, the National Committee on Institutional Ethics was called into an emergency session. The federal board received a dossier from Sheila Moreno containing documents, screenshots of internal communications, and copies of the security footage. The videos captured Dawn's entire ordeal, from the first suspicious glance to the silent push to the sidewalk. But it was the audio that hit hardest. The racist remarks were there, raw, with no room for excuses. The recordings left no doubt. The guards didn't just act without verifying. They expressed contempt and prejudice without hesitation. The committee launched a rigorous, swift review. Cameras, witnesses, and the building's internal records confirmed a pattern of behavior previously reported, but ignored. In past meetings, warnings had been dismissed. Now, with a national case, no oversight could be swept aside. The initial recommendation was unanimous: immediate formal investigation, with the precautionary suspension of the entire security team on duty during the incident. The Federal Department of Justice stressed the need to send a clear message to the country. Abuse of power, especially driven by racism, would no longer find shelter in public institutions. What was once brushed under the rug was now on the record. Dawn's name was no longer just that of a victim. It was a symbol. Outside the building at the time of the incident, a local journalist was covering a routine story on housing policy. By chance, he witnessed a black woman being escorted out by 2 armed guards in front of dozens of silent onlookers. Not knowing who she was, he recorded the moment on his phone. Dawn, standing on the sidewalk, in her dark blazer, staring at the entrance that had just been denied her. It was a stark image, charged with tension. He posted it without much expectation. The caption read, "Black woman forcibly removed from North Carolina DOJ. How long will this go on?" Within an hour, the image was circulating in local groups. In 3 hours, it had crossed state lines. When it hit accounts with millions of followers, outrage erupted. The hashtag China Justice for Dawn formed organically, fueled by angry comments and similar stories. The image's power lay in what it didn't say. It was the face of what thousands endure daily. Independent outlets, advocacy platforms, and influencers began sharing the post. If this happens to a woman in front of the Justice Department, imagine those with no way to fight back, wrote one activist. She's alone, but her story is ours, posted another. Within hours, mainstream media scrambled to catch up with a story the public had already turned into a national outcry. Even those who usually stayed silent started speaking out. Dawn, meanwhile, stayed off social media. She posted nothing, answered no questions. While her image spread across the country without her consent, she worked quietly behind the scenes, with the same focus as always. But the world had changed. What began with suspicious glances in a lobby was now a collective roar. The woman once treated as a threat was now seen as a mirror, reflecting what so many carried in silence. The morning after the image went viral, Marcus DeWitt, the White House Chief of Staff, called an emergency meeting with the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Interior. There was no ignoring it anymore. Dawn Whitaker's name was in major newspapers, and the nation was debating institutional racism within the Department of Justice itself. "We can't treat this as a security slip-up," Marcus said. "It's a structural failure, and it needs a response just as big." Advisors suggested a public apology and a renewed commitment to diversity. But Marcus went further. "Statements aren't enough anymore. This needs visibility. It needs a voice. People need to see this woman represents change, not an apology." That's when the decision was made. Fast-track Dawn's swearing-in ceremony, broadcast live. Show the country who she is, and more. Show that even after being thrown out, she'd walk through the front door with the nation watching. The communications team got to work immediately. There would be members of Congress, Justice Department officials, and the Vice President. The message was clear. Turn the mistake into a symbol, the trauma into transformation. Every word would be measured, every gesture deliberate. Not as a performance, but as a direct answer to the question the country was asking. If this happens to her, who else is being silenced every day? Dawn was informed in a brief, direct phone call. She didn't ask for the ceremony. She didn't demand the spotlight. But she accepted with the resolve of someone who knew the moment wasn't just about her. It was about what she stood for. Hanging up, she realized, there was no going back to anonymity. The woman removed under suspicion would now become, before millions, the face of a justice system in desperate need of repair. At 7 a.m. sharp, the Washington Sentinel ran the headline, "Woman ejected from DOJ was new federal justice advisor, appointed by White House." The story spread as fast as the viral image. Now with a name, a role, and context. Newsrooms cross-checked sources. Within minutes, network TV, radio, and digital platforms were in full coverage mode. The country wanted to know, who was Dawn Whitaker? Her bio began circulating in interview segments and special panels. Daughter of public school teachers, law degree from Howard University, 2 decades advocating for civil rights. She'd led efforts to combat discrimination in prisons and federal schools. She wasn't just someone who knew the system. She knew how to fight it from within. The woman who'd been thrown out was now seen as a cornerstone of rebuilding. While the media frenzy grew, Dawn stayed silent. No interviews, no statements. She declined talk shows and roundtables. "She's speaking through actions, not interviews," Sheila said when pressed by a reporter. And so, Dawn's silence spoke louder than any speech. The woman who wasn't given a chance to introduce herself now filled every space without saying a word. In the weeks following the incident's exposure, former Wallace Building employees began speaking out anonymously on internal forums, social media, and through institutional whistleblower channels. They shared stories of embarrassment, accusatory stares, and aggressive encounters, always with the same pattern. Black people treated as suspects by default. Some said they'd reported the security team's recurring behavior, only to be ignored. Visitors' accounts surfaced too. A social worker described being stopped twice for inappropriate attire, though she wore the same outfit as white colleagues. A federal analyst recounted humiliating searches targeting only black men. Racist jokes disguised as banter were common, and no one acted. What was once discomfort became living statistics, a systemic pattern now gaining visibility. With the weight of these testimonies, the Ethics Committee expanded the investigation. The building that had long symbolized authority and stability was now studied as a case study in ethical failure. The Wallace Building, where careers were launched and major decisions made, was no longer tied to justice, but to prejudice masked as protocol. In this new light, Dawn's case wasn't an incident. It was the tip of the iceberg. Facing national backlash and an ongoing formal investigation, Thomas Crane and Kyle Renner hired private attorneys to prepare their defenses. Both claimed they were following security protocols and didn't recognize Dawn's authority due to unclear identification. The phrases operational error and misunderstanding appeared in every statement to the press and ethics committee. Neither mentioned her skin color directly, but the evidence spoke for them. In one audio clip captured by the internal system, recorded after Dawn's removal, Kyle is heard saying, "She'll probably try to sue. Good luck with that." Thomas replies dryly, "If we don't stop them, this place turns into a free-for-all." The words were spoken out of public earshot, but recorded clearly. Phrases like, "these people," and "too much attitude for someone with no title," underscored the unspoken racism that drove their actions from the start. When the audio and transcripts were released in the official report, their defense collapsed. The narrative of confusion crumbled before a nation that now knew the truth. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about security. It was about who could occupy that space. And the phrase, "we thought she didn't belong," recorded in the disciplinary hearing minutes, became the perfect explanation for why she now did, with unmatched authority. On a Friday afternoon, the Wallace Building's main door opened again. This time, there were no shouts, no hands pushing. Dawn walked in with steady steps, flanked by 4 young lawyers, all black and Latino, dressed in sharp suits, folders in hand, and eyes confident. It was an entrance without fanfare, without a speech, but the symbolic weight of that moment was louder than any announcement. Dawn wasn't returning alone. She was returning as a force. As she crossed the lobby, employees rose slowly from their desks. Some looked away. Others followed her with eyes unsure of what to say. No one dared stop her this time. No ID was demanded. It was as if the building itself, once hostile and silent, had learned to listen, whether it wanted to or not. The sound of her heels on the marble rang like a reminder, not of what had happened, but of what she represented from now on. Dawn didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked to the elevator with her usual calm, pressing the button without haste. When the doors opened, she stepped inside without looking back, her team at her side. Justice now had a face, a name, and a steady stride. This wasn't just about filling a role. It was about claiming a space that had been denied to people like her for too long. And in that moment, without saying a word, Dawn delivered a response that echoed through the building. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The auditorium of the Federal Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. was set up with restraint and gravity. In the audience were officials from various states, Civil Rights Commission representatives, and bipartisan lawmakers. At the center of the stage stood Dawn Whitaker, now officially introduced as Federal Justice Advisor. Beside her were the Vice President, the Attorney General, and 4 members of Congress. Cameras streamed live. Millions watched in real time. Dawn didn't need grandeur to command attention. Her presence carried the weight of the past days and the decades before them. As she approached the podium, the auditorium fell silent. She didn't mention the Wallace Building. She didn't name Thomas or Kyle. She didn't need to. Every pause, every carefully chosen word, spoke directly to the nation following her story. "I'm not here just for what happened to me," she said firmly. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to thousands, every day, in silence. The difference is, today I can and will do something about it." The audience rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't frenzy, it was reverence. It was the start of something new, announced not with flags or lofty promises, but with the resolve of someone who knows what it's like to live under scrutiny and still stand tall. When the ceremony ended, the nation's eyes weren't just on Dawn, they were with her. The woman who'd been thrown out of a building was now entering the nation's official records as a symbol of change. And in that moment, amid applause, cameras, and quiet tears, a new chapter began, not for the image of justice, but for its core. Days after her swearing in, Dawn issued her first official act, the creation of the National Institutional Conduct Audit Program. The initiative would cover all federal public-facing buildings, including justice, immigration, education, and social security departments. The focus was clear: review screening, interaction, identification, and security protocols. Where there were histories of complaints, there would be priority. Punishing isolated cases wasn't enough. It was time to overhaul the system. The plan outlined a detailed audit of 312 federal buildings based on data from the past 5 years. It would cross-reference formal complaints, internal evaluations, and conduct reports. Independent teams would conduct surprise visits, employee interviews, and interaction tests with diverse visitors. Everything would be documented and submitted to a review panel with direct recommending power to the Attorney General. For the first time, the system would face a true reckoning. At the top of the list, the Wallace Building itself, not out of vengeance, but as an example. Dawn wasn't after revenge. She was after transformation. And now, with formal authority, legal tools, and public visibility, she didn't just have a voice, she had reach. What was once just an incident became a national directive, and no one could claim ignorance anymore. With the audit program's rollout, the atmosphere in federal institutions shifted fast. Departments once resistant to change began revising their own interaction and public service protocols. The Social Security Administration issued new internal guidelines. The Department of Education launched racial sensitivity and anti-discrimination training. The Immigration Service requested a voluntary audit. No one wanted to be the next Wallace. Behind closed doors, directors and security chiefs started using a new informal phrase, "because of Dawn Whitaker." It was said seriously, like a caution. Whenever a new rule was introduced or someone argued nothing needed to change, someone would say, "You want to make headlines because of Dawn Whitaker." She'd become more than a name. She was a code, a warning, a new standard of institutional accountability. And while these agencies scrambled to adapt, Dawn's office monitored every step with precision. Not to punish, but to prevent. It was the kind of movement she'd always envisioned, not forcing change through pain, but sparking it through awareness. And, perhaps unintentionally, she'd created something bigger than a response. She'd set a new benchmark. Power wasn't just in titles anymore. It was in the expectation that things be done better because of her. At the conclusion of the formal investigation, the Department of Justice ordered the permanent termination of Kyle Renner and Thomas Crane. Both attended internal disciplinary hearings, where they faced the audio they'd tried to downplay. Neither denied the words, neither contested the videos. Their discomfort was palpable, not for what they'd done, but for being exposed to the entire country. During the session, their own voices echoed in the room. Kyle's laugh, Thomas's cold tone. No shouting, no protests, just the exact playback of what they thought would stay private. When asked about their motives, they gave curt responses. "We acted on what we thought was right," and "she didn't seem like she belonged." No convincing apologies, no words showing growth. The phrase, "we thought she didn't belong," was officially recorded in the hearing minutes. And ironically, it became the rallying cry for why she now did, with ultimate authority. The silence of the two as they left the building, without uniforms, without radios, without a voice, was louder than any protest. And the system that once shielded them now left them outside, just as they'd done to her. Without seeking the spotlight, Dawn Whitaker became a national figure. Her name was cited in universities, legal forums, and institutional training programs. The story of the woman thrown out of a federal building and who returned as a White House-appointed advisor became a case study. It was taught in law, sociology, and public policy courses. The incident was no longer an outlier. It was a mirror of an entire system and how it had finally been challenged from within. At Howard University, where Dawn earned her degree, a panel was held titled Representation, Retaliation, and Reform, the Whitaker Case. Students packed the auditorium. A first-year student, voice trembling with emotion, said into the mic, "She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't react with hate. She acted with the strength of someone who knows exactly who she is and where she belongs." The crowd gave a standing ovation. And in a generation growing up watching her story, a new expectation was born about what it meant to hold power. Newspapers, websites, and magazines kept chasing interviews. Dawn kept declining them all. It wasn't pride, it was strategy. Every refusal reinforced the message she'd set from the start. Actions speak louder than words. And while the country still debated how institutional racism had allowed this, she was already working on the next step. The woman underestimated at the entrance was now the standard for every exit. 3 months after the incident, the Wallace building was unrecognizable, not just inside. The lobby underwent a full renovation. New colors, warmer lighting, accessible signage, and clear plaques outlining visitors' rights. The old central desk was replaced with a circular one, symbolizing inclusion and equality. Beyond aesthetics, it was an attempt to reshape the first interaction between the public and the institution. But the real changes weren't in the marble, they were in behavior. Every visitor was now greeted with a name, ID check, and formal access explanation. Screenings were mandatorily logged and supervised. Monthly racial sensitivity and institutional respect training became required for all staff. The old habit of judging by appearance gave way to a new mantra, serve before you suspect. On the lobby's side wall, where a generic timeline mural once hung, a permanent exhibit was installed. Portraits of black figures who shaped American justice. Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, Barack Obama. And in the center, under glass and natural light, Dawn Whitaker. No exaggerated pose, no triumphant expression. Just the image of a woman who didn't demand space. She earned it, and left it better than she found it. During a routine workday, Dawn crossed the Department of Justice lobby in Washington with her usual steady posture. In the distance, at the visitor check-in line, a familiar face caught her eye. It was Kyle Renner. No longer in uniform, now wearing the gray outfit of a private security contractor, He held a visitor badge, waiting. No radio on his shoulder, no authority in his stance, just an ordinary man in line. He saw her. For a moment he froze, as if time had stopped. His eyes met hers, searching for a reaction, a gesture. Dawn didn't pause. She didn't speed up. She kept walking, spine straight, gaze fixed on him. There was no anger, no arrogance, no revenge, just the quiet truth of someone who no longer had to prove anything. When Kyle's eyes dropped, the moment was complete. He was the one who couldn't face his own past. Dawn continued to the elevator as the lobby resumed its rhythm. To anyone else, it was just another afternoon. But for those who saw what happened, or lived something similar, that silent encounter said it all. Justice isn't just made with laws. Sometimes it's in the weight of a gaze that endures, persists, and moves on. And in that instant, without a single word, Dawn showed that those who carry truth don't need to lower their head, not even after they've already won. Night fell over Washington with a rare calm. On the top floor of the Federal Department of Justice, one office light still burned. Inside, Dawn sat at her desk, reviewing reports, letters of support, new complaints. The walls were plain, unadorned, but on a shelf in a simple frame was a photo of her mother, a woman with a serene gaze, holding an old notebook. Below it, a handwritten note. "Be the change they pretend they don't need." Dawn sighed, pushing the papers aside for a moment. The work she had now wasn't a personal victory. It was a collective journey. Each letter carried a story like hers. Each complaint came from someone who'd also been ignored in a lobby. She no longer carried just a title. She carried the weight and responsibility of breaking down doors that had been quietly shut for decades. Outside, no one saw the late hours, the tough calls, the internal battles. But recognition was never what she wanted. It was reform, structure, truth. And even there, alone with stacks of papers, Dawn felt she'd begun what so many women before her had dreamed of in silence. A space where they didn't have to hide to exist. A space where they could lead and be heard. On her office door, a gold plaque caught the soft light of the empty hallway. Federal Justice Advisor, D. Whitaker. No slogan, no tagline. Just the name of a woman who, for so long, was treated as invisible. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she simply stayed. And in the end, she didn't ask for a space. She became the space. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong, just because of your skin color? Do you think the security guards deserve to be fired? It's super important that you drop your comment. You won't believe the twist that went down in this other story popping up on your screen. Check it out right now.